morning. Welcome to WestVillage, and so glad that you're here. If this is your first Sunday, we're into a series now, as Pastor Tim mentioned, in the book of Samuel. And I don't want to take for granted that everybody in here has grown up in church and gone to Sunday school and knows the stories. For those of you who are in that case, we call church a family. The Bible calls church a family, and what that means, like any family, is that there's those of us who've been around longer than others. I'm the oldest of four boys, and I remember distinctly, especially when I started to hit the teenage years, I lamented having to do things that were more for my little brothers. I remember one time we went to Wonderland, and the whole drive down to Toronto, my brothers were talking tough about how they were going to do all the roller coasters and da-da-da-da, and they were like, oh yeah, Jeff, yeah, I can't wait, we'll run to the lines and blah, blah, blah. We show up, we get in line, and so there's four, and I'm the oldest, and then there's two in the middle, Kevin and James. Reverse that, James and then Kevin, and then my little brother David. And Kevin and James were the ones that were talking all tough on the whole drive down. We get there and we start looking at these roller coasters. We've never seen roller coasters before. And James and Kevin both flake out on me. They're like, I can't do this. I'm looking at my mom, and my mom's like, my mom gets dizzy, like turning around. So it wasn't going to happen. So, and then my father's like, oh man. The only one that wanted to do anything was David. Now, David's 6'2", he's a cop now, but at the time, he was like this tall. And guess what? Dave didn't meet any of the height requirements. I was so mad. Dad and I did, I think, 2 roller coasters, and then Dad tapped out. And then I spent the rest of the time on, the little dinky ones that kind of, yeah. And I was looking at James and Kev going, whatever. So you know what I'm talking about doing things for those in our family that aren't quite there. And what that means is, as we look at some of these Bible stories, we're going to look at David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba and the whole deal with Saul and Jonathan and David yeah. The point is if you've grown up in church, you've heard these stories before. But there are people here, I guarantee you, I've talked to them, who do not know these stories. And we can very easily grumble and go, Let's be better than that. Now, here's the deal with the Word of God, is that every time we come to it, just like the greatest stories ever told and then some, there's new things to learn if we actually will humble ourselves. And so if you've heard these stories a billion times, dare we say that God might still have something to say to you through these stories. And for those of you who are here for the very first time, don't worry, we're not going to leave you behind. Now, it's going to be drinking out of a fire hose, but we're going to catch you up, okay? So ready? All right, if you're new here this morning, Samuel's the name of a prophet and a judge from the Old Testament, okay? He existed around 1000 BC. This is a long time ago. We're talking 3,000 years now, right? And Samuel was a judge or a prophet for a nation called Israel. Now, Israel was God's chosen people. He'd reached out to one of their descendants, a guy named Abraham, and called Abraham to himself. Abraham was off doing his own thing, worshiping his own gods, and by the grace of God and God alone, God reaches down and he tells Abraham, you know what, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to covenant with you. I'm going to make a promise to you. And through that, you are going to be a blessing to the world. He takes this group of people and he calls them to himself, and he gives them a land and these promises. And through a course, if you've seen The Prince of Egypt, they spend some time in Egypt as slaves. They call out to God. Eventually, God redeems them and he pulls them out. And Moses leads these people to the promised land. They go and they fight. God tells them to rid the land of all the people that live there and all of their false idols and everything else, but they don't. Instead, they intermingle, and the book of Judges begins and it ends with, there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And so if you can imagine it, it's very similar. If you love, like Ruth and I right now, we're watching like Vikings and Nightfall and all that medieval stuff. If you think about it, there were like these city-states, and it was a quasi-unified kingdom without a king. And God rose up these people called judges at various times from various tribes in Israel, and they would fight and lead the people, throw off whatever idols they were worshiping, and lead the people back to God most of the time, free them from the other nations that were there. The thing about a judge versus a king is that a judge was called by God for that task, and when it was over, there was no judge again until God called a new judge. If you've watched The Crown, you know the whole thing about descendants, right? It's huge, the bloodline. It's ridiculous, really, in my opinion. I'm not a loyalist, though I respect the crown and everything else, but I find it very funny in our day and age that somebody would get the throne just because their parents were the throne. And on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Judges weren't like that. They were God's man or woman. And Samuel's the last of the judges, called by God to bring his people back to God. And so Samuel records his story and the story really of God. I talked last week about how this is recorded history, but it's more than that. It's revealed history. It's revelation. Because at the end of the day, all of these heroes, and this is where maybe there's something for you if you grew up in Sunday school to learn just for a second. The heroes of these stories are not the heroes of these stories. What do I mean by that? As we go through, you'll see that these characters, while at times they do things that are very God-honoring and very good, at other times they do things that are really God-dishonoring and evil. And maybe you grew up in Sunday school, it was where like, be like David. Don't be like Saul. Be like Samuel. That's not the point of these stories. Sure, we can learn from these characters and everything else, but at the end of the day, God is the hero of these stories. These stories are told to teach us about him. And what we learn about these characters is that with their rise and with their falls, with their triumphs and with their disasters, God is the one who is faithful through it all, working out his plan. Remember I said he promised to Abraham? Abraham made mistakes too, as did everyone to come after him, as did every human to ever live, including us. And the story is about God, the hero, who's faithful. Even though everybody's going up and down and all over the place, God is faithful of bringing about his purposes. And as we'll see this morning, we get this glimpse about what God is really up to as he sets apart Samuel. So if you got your Bibles, you can turn to 1 Samuel. We started last week. The story begins with, there was a certain man. And this is how the stories for Judges always started. What's interesting is there was a certain man refers to Samuel's father, a guy named Elkanah. And he was a godly man. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes during this time period. There was no king. And yet this man chose to follow God. At the end of the book of Joshua, before we go into the time of the judges, Joshua, who took over leading the people into the promised land from Moses, Joshua, at the very end of his book, he recounts everything that God has done for his people. He starts at Abraham and goes all the way through Egypt, through the whole thing. And he says, look, fear God, fear the Lord, fear Yahweh, fear him, live for him, worship him. He goes, you could worship all these other gods, you could do whatever you want, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so there were families who chose to follow that and to live for Yahweh, to worship him, to live for him. And Samuel's father was one of these men, and he would go out year after year after year. He would go to a place called Shiloh. There was no temple yet, but Shiloh was a place where you could go and you could offer sacrifices to Yahweh. And we recount last week, there was this, Elkanah's first wife was a woman named Hannah. And Hannah was barren. She couldn't have any kids. And so in the pecking order, she was almost like Elkanah's second wife. He took a second wife so he could have kids, and Phinehah is her name, and it means pearl, and she has tons of kids, and she mocks Hannah. And yet Hannah, we read last week, rather than scheming, rather than trying to get out of her situation, she pleads to the only one who can help her. And she cries out to the Lord at Shiloh, and she's so upset that the priest Eli thinks that she's drunk. And she makes a promise to God that if she gives him a son, that she will give him back. And we finished last week, God remembers her, the text says. It's not like God forgot about her. When the text in the Old Testament says remembers, God remembers. What it is that he has now chosen to act on behalf of that person. And he gives her a son who she calls Samuel. And then she breaks into song. What's interesting, and what we're going to look at today is Hannah's prayer. Her prayer of praise back to the Lord. If you got your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel. So it's interesting. Every year, Elkanah takes his family up to make sacrifices to the Lord in Shiloh. They didn't live in Shiloh. They lived in a place called Ramah. And after Samuel was born, Hannah doesn't take Samuel yet. She stays behind until, the text says, until he was weaned, which in those days, they didn't have formula and stuff like that. So you'd breastfeed your kid as long as you really could before it got really awkward, right? So I'm reading into that. The point is they would probably breastfeed their kids until they were like at least 3, if not 4 or 5. So when Samuel's finally weaned, think of it like your junior kindergartner. Okay? That's probably how old Samuel was when Hannah decides, you know what, now we're going to go. And she doesn't go up until then because she's not going to leave him. But this time she goes and she does leave him. And I love this part. If you look with me here. Verse 24 of chapter 1. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "Oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I'm the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there, he being Samuel. So you get this thing, right? It's been like 3, 4, 5 years. Hannah's encounter with Eli, as we looked at last week, was kind of weird, right? He thinks she's drunk. She's really, really upset. She's pouring out her heart to God. It says her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. You ever cry like that? You ever pray like that? You can't even formulate the words anymore. You're just so upset. And Eli comes alongside her, and he doesn't even know what she's praying for. He just goes, "Are you drunk?" And she goes, "No, I'm not drunk." And he goes, "Well, may the Lord find favor with you, and I pray with you, and I bless you." Okay, good priest doing his thing. He's like, "I got to get back to writing my sermon. I hope everything works out okay." And he goes on, right? She comes back. She doesn't forget. This is the most important thing that's ever happened in her life. She's barren. All of a sudden, she's got a kid, and he's a great kid, and she's raising him and everything else. And she comes back, and she comes right into Shiloh. They sacrifice the bull, and then she turns to Eli, and she goes, "Hey, remember me?" And he's like, She's like, "Look, I'm the one. I'm the one who was so upset. I'm the one who prayed. Look, this is the child I prayed for. Here he is. And just like I said, I'm giving him to God." Bam. And verse 2 starts. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. Scholars think that this is one of the first extended songs of ancient Israel. And it's by a woman. You know, there's some scholars who think that there's no way Hannah could have come up with this. Like, it's just too good. And I say, whoa. Why not? See, by this time, remember, Moses had went up on the mountain and God had given him the law. The people had been taught. They knew what was right. They knew what was wrong. They knew who Yahweh was. They had recounted everything that God had done. This woman was devout, so devout that she's going to give her son to God. Why can't she? Because she's a peasant? Wait a second. Why can't she? Because she's barren? Not anymore. Last time I checked, though, a womb never, right? That wasn't a fully formulated thought, but you know what I mean. And because she's a woman? What's very interesting is that this prayer at the beginning of 1 Samuel is very, very similar to King David's prayer at the end of 2 Samuel. These two prayers almost, they bookend the saga of the first kings of Israel. Their themes are very, very similar. And what the author is doing here in Samuel is he's setting the stage for everything that's going to come over the weeks that we study. Everything that he records. This prayer sets the stage. And when David comes on the scene and writes at the end, he reflects back and he looks on everything that's happened. But his prayer also projects forward. And there's actually little kernels in here in Hannah's prayer that project beyond David, as we'll see in a second. But what I want us to look at this morning, last week we talked about even when there's no king, God is on his throne. And whatever's going on in our lives, we need to understand that God is not immune to how we feel. He is not far off. He is close and he is personal. And the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies that fights for nations and controls kings and kingdoms, also is intimately involved in every aspect of our lives. And the good things we give him glory, but in the hard things we also give him glory because we understand that he is at work. And what seems in the moment like he has forgotten, he hasn't forgotten. He remembers. The question is will we give him worship? What's so cool about Hannah is that she not only makes those vows, and I don't know about you, but when things are really, really hard, when I'm freaking out, you start saying stuff. I remember as a teenager, like you do something really, really stupid, and you fall to your knees. This is me, I'm dramatic. And you're crying out to God. God, I won't do that. I remember like sometimes it was really stupid. Okay, like a girl would break my heart. But like, Lord, please. If she comes back to me, I promise I will be better. Actually, that's a really good thing to think about. Think of all the things that you've really prayed for God for, that later, if he said no, later you realize, oh, that was really good, he said no. What's that acknowledging, though? He knows. But we've all been in places in our lives where we've poured out like that and we've made promises. What's so cool about Hannah is that Hannah follows through on her promise. She gives Samuel back. And what's really interesting here is that if you notice her prayer, her delight, her joy is not that she had a kid. Her delight and her joy isn't even that she gave the kid back to God. Her delight and her joy is found in who God is. There's this security and this assurance that no matter what goes on in life, the ups, the downs, everything else, that God is in control and he's worthy of her praise. There's two big ideas this morning that I want us to take out of this story. The first one is that God is most worthy of our adoration. He's most worthy. If we're going to look for a king in our lives, let's not shoot for mediocre. There is no one higher than God. And that's why she turns to praise. I love this. She goes, I prayed and I said, my heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I know that's weird. My horn is exalted in the Lord. Horn was a symbol for strength. Okay? What she's saying is my strength is exalted in the Lord. My heart exalts in the Lord. Like everything about me is about making much of him. I love this. My mouth derides my enemies. Literally, it is my mouth has gotten so big it swallows up my enemies. Well, that's not literally. Literally, it's my mouth has been enlarged. But the idea is, remember before she was so broken that her mouth was moving, but she wasn't even making noise. And the other wife was like, that's Hebrew for I had more kids than you and I loved more than you, okay? And she can't even say it. Now she's saying, because my heart, my soul is in the Lord, my strength is found in him, my mouth is enlarged. It's so big, I just swallow up my enemies. Why? Because I rejoice in your salvation. Love verse 2. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. 8 times in these 10 verses, Hannah uses the personal name for God, Yahweh, that was revealed to Moses. 8 times. This wasn't some far-off deity. You notice that she says, my heart, my horn, my mouth. There's this a personal relationship that she has with God, and she acknowledges that he is her God, and there's nobody like him. God is most worthy of our adoration. Here's why. It's the first thing that comes right out of the text. He defies comparisons. He defies them. You know, people get hung up, and I've heard this before, and it blows my mind too. And one day I came to the realization, that's because he's God. This is not a cop-out. When we say, I can't fully understand the Trinity, 3 persons, 1 God, of course I can't understand it fully. There's theories, theologians talk about it and everything else, but this is what God has revealed. It doesn't make sense in a human mind. But 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. I didn't do well in math, so that doesn't make sense to me either. That God is sovereign over everything, and yet at the same time, I have free will and I make decisions. Do I understand? No. Do you want a God that you could fully understand? Because a God that I could fully understand, in my opinion, is not a God worthy of my worship. There is no one, 3 times, no one like God. He's beyond full explanation and understanding. He's unfathomable, he's unsearchable. And yet he's intimate. I love this, verse 3. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge. God of knowledge here is not this idea that the Lord knows a lot. It's this idea that all knowledge comes from him. He knows everything. By him, actions are weighed. Let that sink in for a second. He knows everything, and by him, all actions are weighed. Everything that we do and don't do is weighed by him. He knows everything. Even that, I don't get that. But that's God. I love this. Everything is weighed. Another idea of weighed is that everything is balanced. He sorts everything out. At the end of the prayer, he talks about how everything will be judged by him. And that's where things go. Look at verse 4. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. And the barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. Balances out. It's like, look, there's some people who have everything going for them. They're strong and they're healthy and they got food to eat and jobs and everything else. And then there's others who don't. But God balances it out. He not only defies comparisons, he delivers justice. He delivers justice. So that's what this whole section is about. Remember, Hannah personally would understand this. The idea of born 7, the woman born 7, is like born the perfect amount. 7 was this idea of perfection. I love this. Verse 5, it says, those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. This is just kind of neat about the Hebrew language. To hunger at the end of the verse isn't there in the Hebrew. It just says those who were hungry have ceased. And it's a word that's not used anywhere else in all of Hebrew. They don't fully know what it means, but this idea of cease, the word that's used here, also means lots of fat. So literally in Hebrew, it would read something like this. But those who were hungry have become fat. Can I get an amen? Now remember, we're talking about a time, a place where to be fat, no one was fat. This isn't a derogatory thing. What he's saying is they will have their full. Those who are with want will be full. That is the God who provides. He delivers justice. Here's the last thing about why we need to praise him, or adoration. Look at verse 6. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. And put it like this for our notes. He determines everything. Now, some of you might be like, wait, that's not fair. He determines everything? Life, death, wealth, poverty. Yeah. Now, what I mean by that is not some kind of callous determination, like a fatalistic kind of thing. When the Bible talks about God's sovereignty and his destining everything, what it means is there's nothing outside of his control. Nothing surprises him. Even down the book of Proverbs talks about the roll of a dice. He determines what is good. Just give me a 7. It's funny that people pray about the Super Bowl, but the reality is God's the one who's going to determine the Super Bowl. He's not a Patriots fan, don't worry. God has a larger cosmic plans that are going on. Well, what does that do then to things that are evil? How do we make sense of that kind of stuff? If this is all part of God's plan and he's in control of everything, what does that do to our choices? What does that mean? And that's a whole other sermon series for another thing, but I'll just reference one thing. Joseph, way back when they went into Egypt, okay, Abraham had a son who had another son whose name was changed to Israel. His name was Jacob. He changed his name to Israel, which means wrestles with God, which makes you that's a definition of their relationship. And he had 12 sons. And one of those sons was sold by his brothers. One of my favorite stories, being the eldest of 4. And he went off and he went to Egypt. And everything bad that happened to Joseph, his brothers, one day there's a famine in the land and God's actually in control because he knew there was a famine coming. He determined it all. It's how he actually got his people into Egypt. And the reason he got his people into Egypt is because he told Abraham that he wasn't going to send them straight to the promised land. They were going to go to Egypt first. How was that going to happen? Well, in the mind of God, he's got it all figured out. He knows exactly what he's doing. And he uses, get this, he uses the brothers' evil of selling their brother into slavery. He uses that to get his people right where they need to be. And at the end of Joseph's story, he goes, look, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Put it like this, if you want to understand, try to understand, and I'm trying to understand how God can be fully good, fully sovereign, and yet determine things that are evil. And how we can have free will in the midst of it. It comes down out of that verse. What God meant for evil, or what you meant for evil, God meant for good. In that, we have one action. Okay? One action. What was the action? That the brothers sold Joseph into slavery. Okay? One action. But reflect on the verse again. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. How many intentions were there in that one action? 2. For everything that happens, there is an intention. There's an intention by you and me, and it could be evil, it could be wrong, it can be cloudy, it could be sordid. For every natural thing that happens, there is a scientific intention. The hot air with the cold air made the, scientists, okay? There's an intention. But what's revealed here in the scriptures is that God has an intention with all of these things. And that's why evil things can be brought around by evil people, because they have an evil intention. But God can use those things for good, and God can remain good and holy. Why? Because God's intention is good. And this isn't that far off. We understand this because in a court of law, what are we looking for in guilt or innocence? Usually, most of the time, it comes down to one thing, and that is motive. And that's why everything that God does is pure and holy and good and just. It's why he can work all things together for the good of those who love him. And he's worthy of our adoration. But he's not just worthy of our adoration, he's worthy of our allegiance. Remember Joshua, choose this day whom you will serve. Look at verse 8. Of Hannah's prayer. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. Ash heap, that's weird, eh? The word here in Hebrew describes the dump outside the city. Job 2 references this dump. It's where people who had nothing went. And he's saying, God, she's praying, she's declaring, God reaches down the farthest away. And he elevates them. He's worthy of our allegiance because he elevates the lowly. He raises up the poor. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, and he makes them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Okay, that's not a just scientific description of pillars, and on top is the world that sits on it. It's an expression, pillars of the earth. Maybe you've read some Ken Follett books. There's a title of Pillars of the Earth. It's an expression that talks about the orders of society. Okay, everything that makes society tick and culture, God is in control of that. He has established it. He understands it. He uses it. The very things that judge, the very things that rule, all of those things, at the end of the day, God is the one who set those things up. And I love this, verse 9. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked will be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. See, he elevates the lowly. But he establishes the faithful. The rest of the story goes on and it talks now about Eli's sons. I call them Phineas and Herb, but you can call them Hophni and Phineas. Eli was getting quite old, and the story goes on. It talks about how they would take sacrifices and they would threaten with violence against these people who would come. And so religious people, pious people would come and they would make their sacrifices. And these two priests were corrupt and they would abuse their power, and they would take the parts. Not only would they manipulate the situations and threaten violence, but they would take the parts that were supposed to be offered to God. And what's interesting in verse 18 is it says, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. His mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So while Samuel's growing in the Lord, these two other priests are growing in their judgment before the Lord. Just before that, it says, the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord. For the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. And young Samuel is growing in esteem while these guys are growing in judgment. And I love this. Hannah goes every year and brings her son a new robe, right? Because kids grow like weeds. So every year she brings him this new priestly garment to put on, and he's ministering to the Lord there and ministering to the people, while these guys who became priests because their dad was a priest are abusing their situations. It goes on later to say that they weren't just abusing the people there, they were also using their position of power to coerce young women into sleeping with them outside the temple. These were bad dudes. And I love this. Every year Hannah comes up and Eli prayed for her, may the Lord give you children by this woman. And they returned home. And verse 21, this is the end of Hannah's part of the story. Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. Next week, we're going to look at how God establishes this new priest, a young man named Samuel. We'll get into his story and how he's called. He didn't inherit this from his parents or anything like that. He was called by the Lord separate. But I'm wondering if you're here today, and as I was reading this story, I got to be honest, I got to confess with you that I'm not Hannah. For so many reasons. I'm not a woman. I am barren. I make vows to the Lord all the time. Not all the time. But I make promises when I'm hurting. I try to manipulate situations to get what I want. I try to manipulate God to get what I want. God, if you do this, I'll do that. If I do this, will you do that? Quite frankly, I got more in common with Phineas and Ferb. I got to say that guy's name, Hophni. It's not much better. I take from people. Maybe you're here today and you're thinking about this. Yeah, God's worthy of my adoration. He's worthy of my allegiance. But if I'm honest, I'm actually not that lowly. I'm not poor, and I'm definitely not poor in spirit. And I'm not always faithful either. I don't come through on what I say I'm going to. I don't always act or live with faith and trust in God. Paint these grand pictures of God, but if reality, if I'm really honest and I look at things, God's not on the throne in my life. I am. I sit here in this seat. I rule with arrogance and unfounded, misplaced confidence, whether it be in myself, in my intellect, in my stuff, in my charm. Maybe you're here today and you're like, we read those judgment things and God's going to judge everything. He weighs everything. He balances things out. And the reality is I'm not going to be elevated. I'm going to be put down. What do you do with that? You're like, man, I came to church on Sunday and now I just got pummeled and beat up. Remember I said that the point of the story is not these characters. The point of the story is God. Look at verse 10 really with me to close. This is Hannah's prayer. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. This is the first time in the Old Testament where this idea of an individual who is anointed and who is king is expressed. The word for anointed, you'd recognize, it's the word Messiah. And many scholars throughout the ages have seen that Hannah's prayer here is not just talking about kings that would come with Israel or anointed people for different tasks that God would raise up, like Samuel. But it's talking about the one who would hold that title perfectly, the Messiah, the anointed one, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Philippians 2 talks about this one, and you talk about us not being lowly and us not being faithful, talks about this one who had equality with God, and yet he did not see that as something to be grasped, but instead took on the posture of a servant. The one who was high became low for those who thought of themselves high. And he was faithful. He followed the Lord's will straight to the cross for those who are faithless. And Paul finishes that beautiful refrain talking about Jesus, the Messiah, the anointed one, the King. And he says, so by him every tongue will confess and every knee will bow and declare that Jesus Christ, Greek word for Messiah, is Lord. And so if you're here today and you grew up in Sunday school, or this is your first Sunday and you're hearing about this story for the first time, there's something that resonates true in all of us, and it is this: we've been the king of our own lives, and we have failed at it. And we have a choice today, whether for the first time or for the 100th time, to get off the throne and to give our adoration and our allegiance to the one who sits on the throne and is worthy of all our praise. What that means very simply is turning from our sin, changing our mind about who we are and what we've done, and acknowledging that in front of the one who will judge all, we are guilty. And then the Bible talks about faith, and really at the end of the day, it's about trust. And it's trusting in the one who took all of our guilt, who became poor so that we might become rich, and acknowledging that he died in our place so that we could have a relationship with a holy God, not based on our own merit, but because now we recognize the King of Kings and Lord of Lords and what he did, and now we trust in him, and we let him lead our lives. And our lives become about giving him adoration and him allegiance. The worship band's going to come, and we're going to close in this song. It's Be Thou My Vision, O Lord of my heart. I heard from a friend that they were at another place where they actually changed that lyric. They took out Lord. It's indicative of our culture today, right? I'm not going to bow to anybody. And I agree, there's a lot of things that aren't worth bowing to, and a lot of people that aren't worth bowing to. We have Phineas and Hophnies all over the place who abuse their power and manipulate situations and everything else, and I'm not saying bow down to them. But there is one who is worthy above all. His name is Christ. He is Jesus. He is the anointed one. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is the vision that we are to have. He is the one worthy of us giving our lives to. Why? Because he gave his life for us. And so why don't we stand together and we'll sing this song again. And it's a song of faith. It is a song of recommitment. It is a song of acknowledgement about who Jesus is and what he's done. Let's pray this song together.